Welcome to episode 3 of Joe Riley on drug testing in America, the DOT required drug testing episode, with your sponsor, Straight Line Mobile Drug Testing. And now your host, Joe Riley.
Thank you, Jesse. Glad to be here to talk about DOT required drug testing. DOT stands for Department of Transportation. United States Department of Transportation regulates drug testing for employers that are involved with transportation in the U.S. I'll explain more about that. But I do want to thank our sponsor and our guest, Brandy Helveston. Brandy is the president and owner of Straight Line Mobile Drug Testing and Lab Services. Welcome, Brandy, as our guest and our sponsor. Tell us a little bit about Straight Line.
Hi, Joe. Thank you for having me. Straight Line Mobile Testing is out of Fort Myers, Florida. We are a 24/7 mobile drug and alcohol testing company. We cover various service areas, West Coast to the East Coast.
You mean like California to New York?
I will hop on a plane.
Right. Not for one collection, though.
We're not driving the transit to California.
Yeah. So 100 collections, you'll fly anywhere, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So sometimes I get calls from people, and I'm a drug testing third-party administrator also, and we might get a call from somebody who need 200 collections somewhere, and Brandy, you're my gal to call for that.
All right, I'm ready.
Awesome. So I'm going to talk about DOT drug testing today, and this all started, this DOT, Department of Transportation testing, started back in 1991, actually, okay? And there were a couple of incidents that occurred that got Congress's attention, and they got their attention to pass a bill called the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act of 1991. Hopefully they didn't have to read that bill through, in front of the Senate. But they passed it based on two incidents that occurred. One was the derailment of a New York City subway train that occurred, and people died, and people got hurt, injuries, over 200 injuries, over 5 deaths. And the train operator had a blood alcohol concentration of 0.21 more than 13 hours after the crash. So there's definitely alcohol involved in that New York City subway train crash that killed people and injured people. Also, there was in 1987 a Maryland Amtrak Conrail train crash in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and 6 people died and 174 people were injured, and the several crew members tested positive for marijuana. So again, those two incidents got Congress's attention, and they passed the Omnibus Transportation Employee Act of 1991, requires DOT-regulated employers like trucking companies and airlines to conduct drug and alcohol testing of applicants and employees. The act changed the face of alcohol and other drug testing in the United States and really created our drug testing industry of people like Brandy and I who are in the business of selling drug and alcohol testing. Prior to 1987, there really wasn't any drug testing companies, okay? So within the United States Department of Transportation, there are 5 agencies that are subject to the DOT drug and alcohol testing. These agencies regulate employers that are in those industries, such as FMCSA, which is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, which is trucks and buses on our highways, FAA, which is the Federal Aviation Administration, which is airlines and aircraft mechanical facilities, FRA, which is Federal Railroad Administration, which is our railroads like Amtrak and others, FTA, which is Federal Transit Administration, which is mass transit systems like the New York City subway system and city buses, county buses, wherever you might live. Then there's what's called PISMA, or Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which regulates employers that are in the oil and gas pipeline industries. And also, besides those 5 DOT agencies, the United States Coast Guard, which actually falls under Homeland Security now, does do drug testing and does follow the same regulations as DOT. So we really kind of have 6 agencies. And that main regulation is 49 CFR Part 40 that tells us how we do drug testing. And each of those agencies that I just mentioned has their own individual regulation that tells that particular type of business who should be drug tested and when they should be drug tested and outlines other requirements such as supervisor training and employee education. Guidance for these programs is provided by the Office of Drug and Alcohol Policy and Compliance, or ODAPC, ODAPC, and they provide all the guidance for DOT drug and alcohol testing. So since we started this podcast, we're on episode number 3 right here on DOT regulations. I got a lot of phone calls and a lot of emails that said, hey, I loved your podcast. The first one you did kind of like on the overall status of drug testing in America today. And then your second podcast was about, a hot topic, which is marijuana testing in the workplace. But people said, can you tell me more about DOT required testing? And I said, okay, well, this is a great podcast. And we actually got a bunch of questions. And I gave the questions over to Brandy, and she might have some of her own. But Brandy, let's go ahead and start with the questions we received.
Absolutely. These are great questions. Question number 1, what are the key drug testing requirements for employers regulated by the DOT, and does it vary by DOT mode?
Okay, great question. So DOT mode, again, is those agencies that I talked about. And how we do drug testing doesn't really vary because 49 CFR Part 40 is the overall regulation. But who we test and how often we test them and what type of supervisor training and employee education might be required might vary from agency to agency. The random rates of random testing might vary. But what are the key drug testing requirements? Well, we have to follow strict rules. Collectors need to be trained and qualified. Folks that collect urine specimens, currently urine is the only specimen we use for DOT drug testing. The laboratory that receives the specimen must be certified by SAMHSA, the United States Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. The test results must go from a lab to a medical review officer, who is a licensed physician, that reviews the results, and they rule out any prescription medications that the donor may be taking through an interview with the donor so that they don't get called positive when maybe they're taking Adderall or codeine or some type of prescription that could cause a positive. Another key drug testing requirement is that everything is confidential and that records are kept very confidential, and that in DOT we're really only testing for 5 classes of drugs and not any more and not any less, which are marijuana, cocaine, opioids, and PCP, pencycline, amphetamines, 5 drugs. And those are kind of the key drug testing requirements.
Great. Thank you. How often do DOT-regulated employees need to be tested for drugs and alcohol? This
Great.
is a good question.
Yeah, excellent question. So everybody in the DOT program, when they come to work or move into a DOT-regulated covered position, needs a pre-employment test. So maybe I work for the airline, but I work, sweeping the floor, okay? And now I get a job as a pilot, okay? So I'm in a covered position. I need a pre-employment test. Or I'm a truck driver, and I just graduated truck driving school, and I get a job with J.B. Hunt or some other trucking company. I need a pre-employment drug test. Typically, they can do it, but employers typically do not do pre-employment alcohol testing. If I have an accident based on certain criteria, I need a drug and alcohol test. If there's reasonable suspicion determined by a trained supervisor that I could be potentially impaired, I need to have a reasonable suspicion drug and alcohol test. DOT agencies require that the employers do random testing, and this is where the random testing rates might vary. For example, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration is 50% annually for drugs and 10% annually for alcohol. FAA is 25% annually for drugs, 10% annually for alcohol. We typically do those quarterly, so if we had 100 employees in that random pool, we're typically at 50%. We're going to be doing about 12 to 13 employees per quarter. Then also, someone who's had a violation, had a positive test, or a refusal to test is required to have a return to duty test after rehabilitation. and required to have a schedule of follow-up testing after rehabilitation. So there's different types of reasons for tests, and how often they get tested is going to depend on, obviously, once for pre-employment, how lucky they are for randoms, and hopefully they don't have an accident, hopefully they don't have reasonable suspicion, hopefully they don't have a violation and have to do return to duty and follow-up testing.
Great, thanks. That's why it's important to know your agencies and, the rules that are behind it. FMCSA is different from, FAA, let's say. Good, thank you. What types of drug testing are required by the DOT? For example, urine, oral fluid, or hair?
Okay, so interestingly enough, we've been testing with urine since this all started, and we continue to test for urine. However, oral fluid is on the horizon. It's just not here yet. We're almost there. We're almost at the finish line where DOT, they've actually already approved oral fluid testing as a concept, but the laboratories must get SAMHSA certified for doing the oral fluid testing, and that's a very rigorous process to actually implement that at the laboratory. So for drugs, we use urine currently, oral fluid in the future. And for alcohol, we use a breathalyzer machine, an evidential breath alcohol device, which must be on an approved list that's published by NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. For alcohol, we can use an instant saliva alcohol device, but if that test is positive, it must be confirmed with an actual evidential breath alcohol testing device, and it must be a device that is approved. I get calls sometimes from some people, Brandy, that say, well, I bought this $100 breathalyzer on Amazon, and what do you think happens then?
Well, that's not going to work.
It's not going to work.
That's not going to work.
Not an approved device.
That's exactly.
Yeah.
And your certification is device specific.
Yep.
So if you want to be certified to do calibrations, it must be on that specific machine.
Yeah, I get people that call me up and they want to get training for alcohol testing. I said, what device do you have? They said, I don't have one. I said, well, you need a device first before I can train you on that device. Yeah,
right.
So,
right.
Yep.
And I know we're all patiently waiting for oral fluid.
Yep.
And
absolutely.
Don't you offer the oral fluid training?
Absolutely. So, they finally came out with the actual oral fluid device that's going to be used. It's called the Quanticell 2, and it's kind of a split specimen device. You're going to put these two pads that are kind of stuck together in your mouth and get enough saliva. And when they come out of the mouth, they're going to break into two different pads of saliva and go into two different tubes so that we have a split specimen. So we've trained probably about 200 people.
Nice.
I believe you were trained.
I was.
As a trainer, obviously, also.
I was.
I was in New York last month. I trained a whole bunch of people that work for the New York City subway system and the bus system. So that was exciting. But as we actually get laboratories approved for testing, there'll be over 20,000 collectors all over the United States that are looking for training. And so folks like me and folks like you, Brandy, will be able to help those folks out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're excited about it, too. What should employers do if an employee tests positive for drugs or alcohol?
Well, that's a great question, because once somebody tests positive for drugs or alcohol, the employer calls us or calls you and says, what do I do now? And you're supposed to know what you're going to do now. You're supposed to know what the regulations say as an employer. But employers rely on folks like Brandy and me as TPAs to get guidance, and we're happy to provide guidance. So the first thing that you have to do when you know that somebody's positive for drugs or alcohol is remove them from the safety-sensitive position. And that means as a DER, designated employer representative, who's in charge of the program at the company, must be available to receive a phone call on an alcohol positive, because somebody could be sitting at a clinic somewhere and test positive for alcohol, and the truck's out in the parking lot. They can't drive that truck back. They're positive for alcohol. So the first step is removal from the safety-sensitive position. The second step is the employer must provide to that person a list of substance abuse professionals, or what we call SAPs, so that they can engage the services of their SAP to go through a rehabilitation program. And they have to go through that program in order to be eligible to come back to work in a DOT safety-sensitive position. That means they have an initial evaluation, they're prescribed treatment and or education, and then they have a final evaluation. Then they'll need a return-to-duty test. If the company's going to take them back, they don't have to. They might have terminated them, but they still have to give them that list of SAPs. And if it was pre-employment, they didn't hire them, but they still had to give them that list of SAPs. And if it's FMCSA, that individual driver also gets reported to the FMCSA clearinghouse, which puts a prohibited status on that driver and sends that prohibited status over to the State Driver's License Bureau. And not only can that person not go back to work until they go through the SAP program, their CDL license is going to be downgraded until they have that return to duty test, and that gets them off the prohibited list.
Right. Okay. Can you explain the role of the designated employer representative, DER, in DOT drug testing programs?
So every company that's regulated by the DOT, whether they know it or not, they are required to have a designated employer representative or a DER. That is the person in charge of the DOT drug and alcohol testing program. That is a person that must have authority to remove somebody from a safety-sensitive position. That is a person that must be available 24/7 if you operate 24/7 to get results. And you may have more than one DER because maybe you're on vacation and somebody's the backup DER. That can happen. Now, a lot of times DOT-regulated companies will call us up, trucking companies or aircraft maintenance facilities, and we'll say, well, who's your DER? And they'll say, what's a DER? They don't even know what it is. So if you're out there and you get a job somewhere and they say, well, you're going to also be the DER. You're going to be the safety manager and you're going to do this, this, and this, but you're also going to be the DER. If you don't know what that is, we offer training, what we call designated employer representative, DER training, where you can learn how to be the DER for your company. It's not hard, but it's like any job. If you've never done it before, you definitely need some training. And I think you've even taken that training, Brandy, correct?
I have.
Excellent. What did you think of it?
It was great.
Okay.
It was great. It's very has a lot of information. It definitely describes exactly what a DER is and what your role is.
Okay. Excellent.
What are the penalties for non-compliance with DOT drug testing requirements?
Okay, so penalties and fines and maybe be putting out of service, which means you're out of business if you're non-compliant. So every new, like in the trucking industry, every new trucking company gets what's called a new entrant audit or new entrant exam, where a DOT inspector, which might be a state highway patrol person, they come out and they say, okay, let's make sure that you're meeting all of the regulations. And there's a whole bunch of safety regulations and hours of service regulations and mechanical and equipment regulations. But let's also look at the drug and alcohol testing regulations. Okay, you got 6 drivers. Do you have 6 pre-employment tests that are negative? No, we didn't know we had to do that. And do you have a random testing program? No, we don't know we had to do that. And do you have a policy? No, we didn't know we needed a policy. Well, you need all those things. And on that new entrance exam, they're going to give you like 30 days to get all that. And that's when a trucking company might call me or might call you, Brandy, and say, hey, can you set me up with a DOT drug and alcohol testing program? And can you get me a certificate of compliance by this afternoon?
I will set you up, yes, but you not by this afternoon.
It depends what time. Maybe it's first thing in the morning. But here's what I say. I say, okay, well, I can do what I need to do, but there are a bunch of things that you need to do. And if you do all those things in the next hour, then yeah, I probably could get you set up. Okay. And one of them's going to be to pay for your program.
There you go.
And another one's going to be to send me your list of drivers and to call Brandy and start testing those drivers.
Right.
Because they need pre-employment testing.
Absolutely.
But to get back to the crux of the question, what are the penalties? They could be fines. Usually fines start at about $11,000. Okay. The major airlines all get it audited every single year for their drug and alcohol testing programs. I've been to aircraft mechanical facilities that get audited. Sometimes we do mock audits for airlines or for aircraft mechanical. I've seen fines of $10, $20, $30, and $100,000 because of noncompliance, because it's a safety issue, and somebody could die because you're not in compliance, and therefore they're going to penalize you. And if it's really egregious and it's negligent and you've been told to get in compliance and you haven't, they can put you out of service. They can basically deny your ability to operate for a period of time. So that can be very, very serious. And the cost of hiring somebody like Brandy or myself to help manage the drug and alcohol testing program is minimal as compared to what the fines are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How should employers handle reasonable suspicion drug testing under DOT regulations?
Okay, so reasonable suspicion refers to the fact that somebody might possibly be impaired at work. We might think they are. We might guess that they are. We don't know for sure. How would we know for sure, Brandy?
Well, supervisor training is always wonderful.
Right, but what's the fact that tells us that, yes, they were impaired?
Well, they need a collection done.
The outcome of the test,
right.
Exactly. So here's where it starts. DOT-regulated companies are required to have their supervisors trained in reasonable suspicion, signs and symptoms of being under the influence of drugs, as well as the harmful effects of drugs, as well as signs and symptoms of being under the influence of alcohol, as well as the harmful effects of alcohol. And that training is 1 hour of each, and we combine it into a full 2-hour training. So any supervisor who is supervising DOT-regulated employees is required to have that supervisor training. And for some of the agencies, it's recommended that they have recurrent training. They don't say exactly how often, but I say about every 2 years is probably good. The FAA actually requires recurrent training. They don't say how often, but again, I say about every 2 years. So now the supervisor's trained and they're comfortable in observing somebody, and they have a checklist to check things off like staggering, slurred speech, the smell of marijuana, the smell of alcohol, being belligerent, stumbling, crashing the truck. All types of things that they can check off and say, well, I checked off more than 2 things here. This is definitely potentially reasonable suspicion.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily mean they are impaired, but we have to find out the truth. And we find out the truth with the drug and alcohol test. I have a lawyer friend, Bill Judge, who has done presentations for many, many years on reasonable suspicion, and he always said that anything more than a hunch is reasonable suspicion. So it's kind of like the old saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. But if it looks like impairment, it probably is impairment.
Absolutely.
Okay. He also relates it to a football field, and he says, if being straight and sober is the 0-yard line, if they get over the 5-yard line, that's reasonable suspicion. And the supervisors shouldn't feel bad about taking somebody for a reasonable suspicion test and it comes back negative.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
It was a safety issue, and we wanted to rule out that whatever we were seeing and hearing and smelling was not drugs or alcohol. So it's always about being a safety issue.
Absolutely. And the supervisor training is so good because it really helps them identify, is Susie just being silly today, or is Susie really impaired? So that training is very important.
Yeah, and also prevents things like sometimes I get a phone call that says, well, Bob's acting funny today. Can we do a reasonable suspicion test on him? Well, acting funny is not necessarily reasonable suspicion, okay? Oh, well, actually, sometimes they actually say, Bob's acting funny. Can we do a random test on him? Okay. Well, there's nothing random about that, okay? If he is showing signs and symptoms, things that you see, things that you hear, things that you smell, not just acting funny, and not that just somebody said, hey, Bob's drunk,
right,
or Bob smoked a joint.
Right.
The supervisor must observe it, and the training is great for that.
And document everything.
Absolutely.
Awesome. This is great. What advice do you have for DOT-regulated employers when selecting a drug testing provider?
So every DOT employer, unless they're a real major company, needs a third-party administrator, a TPA, drug testing provider, to help them with their drug and alcohol testing program, to get guidance, to make sure everything's being done within the regulations. So there's lots of people out there that sell and service drug testing. Now, my advice first would be who not to go to, okay? Don't go to your local urgent care center to get your DOT program. They do know how to collect urine, but they know nothing about the regulations in most cases. Go to a professional drug and alcohol testing company that has a website that can answer your questions, can tell you that they have trained professionals, can give you references that might be listed with the Better Business Bureau. Check your references, do your homework, get quotes, look at pricing. The cheapest one isn't always going to be the better. The cheapest one may not have insurance, and if something bad happens, that's going to be terrible.
Absolutely.
So check references, talk to the people, make a phone call and talk to Brandy or talk to me or talk to one of my team members and see what kind of comfortable feeling you got. Do we know what we're talking about?
Right. What companies have you done policies, for?
Yep.
You can always ask those questions.
Absolutely. So, Brandy, any other questions that you have or?
No, they gave you very good questions. They covered everything.
Okay,
These
excellent.
are great.
And I want to thank you, Brandy, and Straight Line Mobile Testing and Lab Services as our sponsor for today's episode. Tell us just real briefly about what does Straight Line do? Straight
Line Mobile Testing is in Fort Myers, Florida. We are a 24/7 mobile drug and alcohol testing company. We cover all the way from Miami to Fort Myers Beach, service area, all of Florida, if we need to.
Excellent. And you help people with their DOT compliance needs?
We do. We also offer consortium for CDL holders, clearinghouse, return to duty test. We also do policy creation, updating policies, going through policies, making sure that they, are within state law and everything looks good.
Excellent. Again, thank you for being a sponsor.
Well,
and DOT required drug testing is a hot topic because there's probably about 8 million DOT regulated employees throughout the nation. Maybe about 700,000 DOT regulated employers. So we thought this was a great topic. Thanks for listening in. We hope that you come back to the next episode, which is going to be what you need to know about starting a drug testing business. And we're really honored that Brandy's going to be back with us because she just started her drug testing business back in 2024, and she's really doing well with a new business. So she's going to share her experiences on the next episode on starting a drug testing business. We're
excited about that one.
Absolutely. Other topics that may come up, we're looking for you to send in some ideas about topics. We are going to cover what's a 5-panel drug test, what's a 10-panel drug test, what are some of the other drug test panels, which there's literally hundreds of them, and understanding all of that. And then another episode, which we talked briefly about today, is the reasonable suspicion of impairment leading to a drug test. So I would like you to let us know your questions, let us know your suggestions for future topics. Please share this podcast. Please ring the bell, subscribe, tell your friends about it in the industry, post it on your social media, make a comment. Jesse, anything else I'm supposed to say?
No, that's perfect, Joe. You nailed it.
All right.
After only 3 episodes, you got it down.
So you can close us up, Jesse. I think that's it for today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for tuning in. And once again, like, share, subscribe, click the bell. And till next time, thank you so much, guys.